Hello everybody, welcome to my first long-form review. I'm going to be reviewing the entirety of the Nightmare on Elm Street franchise, and then I'm going to give it an overall score calculated from the scores that I give the individual movies. I've decided to start this series, the long-form series, on A Nightmare on Elm Street because it's my second favorite horror franchise, only beat by Saw, and it was the first horror franchise I was ever introduced to. My mother showed me the first movie when I was 4 years old, and I've had night terrors for the majority of my childhood. Anyway, before I get into it, I just want to say I've grown a lot in subscribers since my last video. As of recording this, I'm at 77 subscribers. That's freaking crazy. I will say though, based on the poll I made, data shows that 100% of people are here, which means I should have 8 billion subscribers. But hey, that just goes to show that you 77 are ahead of the curve. Now, before we dive into the first film, the movie that started it all, I do want to say some things. I'm not counting any of the documentaries. I'm not counting any of the games, comics. I'm not counting that one episode of The Goldbergs. I'm not counting the epic rap battle. And lastly, I am not gonna count the TV series. But originally, I planned to. I planned to count the TV series. I have not actually seen the TV series before I started making this video. So I thought, oh, that'll be fun. A little sprinkle of something new for my second favorite horror franchise. It's a little treat. It's gonna be fun. I was mistaken. The show is bad. Terrible. It's probably the worst show I've ever seen in my life. That's not an exaggeration either. It is terrible. It is mind-numbingly bad. In fact, after I've started watching it, and I still intended to incorporate it in this video, I was going to give the franchise 2 scores, one including the TV series and one that doesn't, because I thought it would be unfair to the movies to have such a score killer incorporated. But I couldn't finish it. There's 2 seasons, each with 22 episodes, and every episode is an hour long. That's 44 hours! That's 4 hours short of being 2 days straight, and 4 hours more than a full-time work week. And it's so boring. It's torture. It's actually torture. I couldn't watch it. So, yeah, I'm not doing the TV series either. Oh, and one more thing before we get into the movies. So usually on my channel, when I review a movie, I kind of describe the whole plot point by point. But with these long-form reviews, I'm just going to assume that you've already seen the movie and then just give my thoughts about the movie overall to save time. That being said, let's get started with the first movie. So the original 1984 Nightmare on Elm Street, this movie is fantastic. The music is perfectly eerie, and the build-up is done so wonderfully, and it's something that future directors of this franchise took for granted. Because at the start of the movie, we don't know who Freddy Krueger is, which is hard to imagine. In fact, I'm kind of jealous of moviegoers in the 80s, because I grew up knowing that Darth Vader was Luke's father and who Freddy Krueger is. But when you're in the theater, and you're watching it all for the first time, it's a whole different experience. However, I can still immerse myself in the limited knowledge that the characters have. And this movie does a phenomenal job at creating this ominous air of mystery surrounding Freddy Krueger. Truthfully, that is the best kind of horror. Speaking of the main characters, let's talk about Nancy. Nancy is definitely a top 5 final girl for me. In fact, she could be number 1. I didn't make a list. Now, her parents, they're total assholes. They don't believe her that somebody's coming after her in her dreams and trying to kill her while she's asleep. They just write her off as crazy. And I mean, most people would. Initially. But after repeating information that she shouldn't know, pulling Freddy's hat out of a fucking dream, and having her boyfriend's bed turn into a goddamn blood volcano, I think most people would start to have an open mind. So yeah, her parents are definitely not helping the movie score. But despite this, Nancy still fights Freddy alone. Personally, if I were in her shoes and I was going up against Freddy, I would just kill myself. I would just go buy a gun and kill myself because I don't want to fuck with that. So standing up to Freddy is already an achievement in my eyes. But Nancy, she goes full Home Alone and sets up a bunch of traps, and then she pulls Freddy out of her dream and just beats the shit out of him. And when that doesn't work, she essentially just tells him to fuck off, and that works. And I don't think I need to say anything about Robert Englund's performance. He killed it like it was a small, helpless child. This movie is one of my all-time favorite horror films, and it's one of my all-time favorite films. It's genius in almost every way. So we're starting the franchise off with a 10 out of 10. And that means it's only downhill from here.
Now I have a story that I'd like to tell about this guy. You all know me as me scared as hell. He comes to me at night after I crawl into bed. He's burnt up like a weed.
Before I started watching this movie, I had no idea about the gay controversy that was surrounding it. And in case you're unfamiliar with this movie's gay controversy, apparently a lot of the subtext, was gay. Or in other words, our protagonist, Jesse, is a closeted homosexual. And Freddy Krueger represents homosexuality. That's a weird fucking sentence, huh? And Freddy Krueger is gay. And spoiler alert, Jesse triumphs over Freddy Krueger by embracing his heterosexual relationship. So yeah, this movie is homophobic. So that's definitely not bagging some good points. But even worse than this movie being homophobic, Freddy's sweater in this is ugly as hell. That is just salt in the wound to the queer community. And because of this underlying subtext, Freddy's goal in this movie is to possess Jesse and get him to kill for him. And that just makes no goddamn sense because he did just fine killing people on his own in the first movie. And on top of that, a lot of the scenes in this movie are just poorly executed. One example of this is when Jesse and his girlfriend are reading Nancy's diary. They turn the pages way too fast. You know, they're not actually reading it. You can actually see that it's blank. And I might be mistaken, but I'm pretty sure Nancy doesn't find Freddy's name out until after Tina dies, and the diary retcons that. And then there's this scene where Jesse goes to his friend's house.
It's starting to happen again. Hey, man. The fuck's wrong with you, dude?
He's getting horny. That's what happens when gay people get horny. I mean, this scene was pretty cool, but outside of this scene, the kills in this movie are boring as shit. Yeah, this movie is just a giant fucking mess and a giant fall from grace. It's getting a 2 out of 10, and this puts the franchise at a 6 out of 10. Our protagonist this time around is Kristen, and Kristen has the ability to bring people into her dreams, and she's also on a psych ward. And Nancy's back. She's introduced to Dr. Gordon, not that Dr. Gordon, who is looking over a lovable cast of goofy teenagers. Jennifer, Will, Joey, Taryn, Kincaid, and Philip. And all of them are being haunted by gay. We're also introduced to some creepy nun that occasionally appears throughout the film. Now, Nancy is on a drug called Hypnocil, which prevents her from dreaming. She tries to prescribe it to the patients, but due to the fact that it's experimental, it just doesn't happen. They don't allow that shit. Philip is the first to die, and it's one of the most gruesome deaths in the entire franchise. He is puppeted by his veins and forced to commit suicide. And after this, Dr. Gordon thinks, well, let's try Hypnocil. Anyway, with the help of Nancy, Kristen channels her powers to bring everybody into a single dream where they can fight Freddy Krueger together. That's right, in this movie, they try to defeat Freddy Krueger with the power of friendship. Meanwhile, Dr. Gordon goes on a scavenger hunt to find the remains of Freddy and bury him in hollowed ground, as were the nun's instructions. Now, what follows is a lot of fun scenes before Freddy is eventually defeated not just by the power of friendship alone, but also the power of Jesus. And that's when the nun is revealed to be Freddy's mother. Now, I really enjoyed this movie, but I'm not a huge fan of the religious elements being added, nor do I think we need to explore Freddy's origin beyond his crime spree in Springwood. And I also do want to note that this movie was a step away from horror and a step towards the cheesy Freddy that is now so iconic. And I'm conflicted on that, because I love cheesy Freddy just as much as the next guy, but I also wanted to see some more of horror Freddy, because I think that's the bread and butter of the franchise. In other words, I think they took that step a bit too soon. But I'm sure a lot of people would disagree with me there, And you know what? We got what we got. So another issue I had with this movie is that they killed Nancy off. I think she would have made a major improvement on the rest of the franchise. All that being said, I give the movie an 8 out of 10, which brings the franchise to a 6.7 out of 10, and I will round that number up or down once we've settled on a final score.
Can't sleep tonight, 'cause I gotta run, gotta hide, and I'm running.
So this movie starts off with the same protagonist, Kristen. Joey and Kincaid are also in this film, but pretty soon we're introduced to an insufferable cast of stereotypes. Now, this movie tried to do what A Nightmare on Elm Street 3 did, which is create a lovable main cast and have Freddy weaponize their fears and flaws against them. But this movie does not have the same level of characterization as the last film. And also, Kincaid is killed off unceremoniously, which sucks. Joey follows shortly after, but at least he gets a creative death. Kincaid was kind of just stabbed at the end of a boring dream sequence, so that sucks. The dialogue in this movie is hacky, and the acting isn't quite there either. There's also a scene where Kristen gets knocked out and sent to the nurse's office, and then we get a scene of Robert Englund in drag, as if we're supposed to believe that she's awake right now. Anywho, Kristen, the protagonist, dies, but she passes on her dream powers to Alice, who becomes our new protagonist. And I do want to give the movie props for this, because killing the protagonist and then changing the protagonist really does give that feeling that nobody's safe, which is good. And after a handful of fun and not so fun deaths, we find out that Alice absorbs her dead friend's skills. She's like a grief-fueled Mega Man. Anyway, Alice eventually defeats Freddy by showing him how ugly he is. More like Little Nightmares on Elm Street, am I right? This movie is not the best by a long shot, but it's also not the worst. It's getting a 4 out of 10 from me. This puts the franchise back at a solid 6 out of 10. We once again start the movie with the same protagonist, Alice, and her boyfriend, Dan. And like always, we're introduced to a main cast of characters. And although the characters are a lot more like characters in this movie than the last movie, they still don't compare to the Dream Warriors group, because instead of striving to make the characters better, they decide to delve further into Freddy's lore. We see his mother give birth to him, and he's an ugly-ass baby. And I honestly think all the unnecessary backstory takes away from the horror of Freddy Krueger. It's much scarier to leave his pre-Springwood slasher days a mystery, because saying he's the son of 100 maniacs and born to a nun that says that's no creature of God, it pulls the movie further from the reality that monstrous people like Freddy Krueger exist. In other words, it takes the edge off of Freddy Krueger. And all that being said, this movie is actually Freddy at his funniest.
Back here, Dan!
So, that's a positive. Anyway, Alice finds out that she's pregnant right around the time she's wondering how Freddy Krueger is killing all of her friends while she's awake, because she's under the belief that she needs to pull people into her dreams in order for Freddy to kill them. Well, it turns out that Freddy is using her unborn child's dreams, and that is genuinely clever writing. However, I want to talk about Alice, because while Freddy Krueger has the ability to kill you in your dreams, Alice has the ability to give you a headache through your screen because of how sheer fucking stupid she is. To start, early on, Alice meets Freddy's mom, the nun from the third movie, and she tells her to find the tower. And yeah, it's cryptic, but Alice is in no rush to find out what the hell that means. On top of that, she doesn't ever seem scared to sleep, and at no fucking point in time does she ever question whether or not she's dreaming. But that is not the extent of her idiocy. Oh no. That is the surface. Because once her survival instinct kicks in and she realizes that power naps are not the way to defeat Freddy Krueger, she starts telling everybody, and I mean everybody, how Freddy Krueger is gonna kill her in her sleep unless she finds the ghost of a dead nun. She says this in front of her doctor, she says it in front of police officers, and despite her friend telling her to tone down the crazy talk in front of such authorities, she completely ignores her as if she has no self-awareness about how delusional she sounds. And God, does she info dump, including information that we already know. I just absolutely despise this character. But moving on, her friend Mark gets sucked up into a comic strip, and it's one of the funnest scenes in the entire franchise. Very Dream Warriors-esque. And at the end, Alice's unborn child and the ghost of Freddy's dead nun mother join forces to banish Freddy back into his mother's womb. And I know I talked a lot of shit about this movie, specifically Alice, and that's because there's a lot of shit in this movie, especially Alice. But it has some of the most fun moments in the franchise, and again, the characters outside of Alice are a good deal more interesting than the characters in the last movie. I'm gonna give this movie a 6 out of 10, which means the franchise is also staying at a 6 out of 10. So this movie opens up with a long, goofy dream sequence, and it's not that scary, and it's not that funny, but it is super boring, and that kind of just sets up the tone for this movie. The dialogue in this movie is drier than my vag at an old school Baptist church, and the acting in this movie is flatter than a skeleton's ass. In fact, the majority of conversations in this movie are just borderline cringe. They're terrible. So this movie has two protagonists. This dude, who's an amnesiac, and this chick, who's a therapist or some shit. I don't really know. And they decide to pack up and go to Springwood because this dude is starting to have memories from being there. So the town of Springwood is totally like loony. Everybody accepts that Freddy Krueger is this evil dream demon, and the town no longer has children, and everybody in it are super cuckoo and wacky. And when they're there, they find out that Freddy himself had a child. And this dude thinks, oh my god, it's me. I'm Freddy's child. I have to be. And then Freddy kills him and reveals that his child is actually the chick. This whole movie was a painful watch, and I'm kind of convinced that the writer and or director of this movie has never seen a movie. Let's run through some nitpicks I had with this one. Freddy having a kid is a dumb idea. It was never established, it's completely unnecessary, and it doesn't make sense for his character. They also retcon his motivations for going on this revenge spree to include taking his daughter away, which is also just stupid. And again, I'm not a fan of the nun shit, but this shit is somehow worse. Speaking of the nun shit, it's never addressed how Freddy came back from the previous film, and when Freddy lists out all the ways people have tried to stop him, he neglects to mention it. They also made up some lore about how Freddy got his powers, and it just seems silly. And though I think it's unnecessary, I'm not totally opposed to having some explanation as to where Freddy got his powers, but these flying eels were not the way to go about that. The whole town of Springwood being loony bin crazy was also dumb, and it was stupid, and I didn't like it. There's the scene right before the chick is about to kill Freddy, where Freddy cries, and it seems like for a short moment there, the movie proposed the idea of having sympathy for Freddy, which is so tone deaf. He's a fucking child murderer. And a little bit more, but we'll get to that later. And when she does kill him, it's just the same thing Nancy originally tried, but for some reason it just works this time. The only thing this movie has going for it is some fun kills, and I will give it props for that. This movie also has a handful of iconic Freddy moments, but it's not saving the film. It's another 2 out of 10, and this brings the franchise down to a 5.3 out of 10. Heather Langenkamp is back, and she's playing herself this time. That's right, this movie is a meta flick. The story goes that some ancient evil entity attached itself to the Nightmare on Elm Street films as Freddy Krueger, because Freddy Krueger coincidentally captured the entity's personality. However, this also meant that the entity was trapped in the Nightmare on Elm Street movies until they stopped making them. So now, this evil entity is able to enter the real world while still maintaining his Freddy persona. And this means children, much like my younger self, can no longer take reassurance in the fact that it's just a movie. Now, I'm a big fan of meta. In fact, I'm a big fan of Wes Craven meta. In case, dear viewer, you didn't know, Wes Craven also directed Scream, and this movie has some clever writing. In fact, Wes Craven wrote himself into the movie as the writer of the movie, and was writing the movie as the events of the movie were unfolding. You get all that? And listen, I am quick to crack down on unnecessary fan service. I think unnecessary fan service can poison a film. But the way the fan service in this film is written, it actually serves the plot, and it is so fucking good. And I only have 2 issues with this movie. The beginning of the movie is just a bit too slow for my liking. It's not a major gripe. I just wish we saw more of Freddy sooner in the film. And secondly, the climax is a bit lackluster. I was hoping for something more climactic. Still, this movie gets an 8 out of 10, and this brings the franchise back up to a 5.7 out of 10.
You got a healing factor? I gotta kill bitches on the ceiling factor. Under that mask, you're a singer slash actor. Under my skin, I'm a slasher slash slasher. Bitch.
So this movie I'm heavily conflicted on, and so I'm going to break it down with the pros and the cons. Starting with the pros. I love the development of Springwood in this movie. They picked it up where the last film ended, where everybody is like aware of Freddy, but instead of being all schizo about it, they treat Freddy Krueger like a disease, and they sort of quarantine people who have nightmares about him. I think that's very clever. They also reintroduced Hypnosil, which is an amazing callback that is so well incorporated into this movie. And of course, the fight scenes are fucking epic. They really knew what the fans wanted to see with these 2 horror icons going head to head. But let's get to the cons. Linderman is an insufferable character. I hate him and he sucks. Freddy does a lot of info dumping in this movie. He just straight up tells the audience what's going on with his powers, and that just kind of sucks. And there are a lot of contrived scenes in this movie, but there's one that really stands above the rest. There's this scene where this police officer shows up inside of a teen's house to drop in on their conversation about Freddy Krueger so he can info dump about Jason.
Now that big ass motherfucker back at the cornfield, alright, that's who we should be afraid of. Tell me who the fuck that was.
His name was Jason Voorhees.
Shit, man. How'd you know we were here?
Nothing personal, but the Scooby van out back wasn't exactly subtle. And never keep your keys in the door.
Great, so now we're completely fucked.
No, you're not. I'm here to help you. Now, this Jason Voorhees supposedly drowned.
He has no reason to be there. He has no reason to aid a bunch of teenagers in their wacky plot. He doesn't even really know them. It makes no fucking sense for him to just show up like this. It is definitely in competition for one of the most contrived moments in mainstream cinema history. And the biggest con of this movie, the biggest, hunkiest, brutish con of this movie is Jason himself. They did Jason absolutely dirty in this movie. This does not feel like a crossover between A Nightmare on Elm Street and Friday the 13th. This feels like A Nightmare on Elm Street 8, guest starring Jason Voorhees. Allow me to elaborate. First of all, no Kane Hodder, and that's a huge fucking L on behalf of whoever made that decision. They didn't give Kane the role because of the height difference between him and Robert Englund. They wanted Jason to be this hulking figure that towers over Freddy. And that makes sense, but put the guy on fucking stilts. Everybody and their schizo mother wanted Kane Hodder to play Jason, so fucking figure it out. Secondly, Jason in this movie is not written as this huge threat. Obviously, in the Friday the 13th movies, he's the only killer, so he is the threat, you know? But when he shares the screen with Freddy, well, Freddy kind of steals the show. It's in character for him to do that. But this leaves Jason with a lot less hype. And instead of intentionally writing Jason as this force to be taken seriously, he's kind of just a background killer until he goes up against Freddy. And my final issue with how Jason is portrayed in this movie is probably the problem that spawned my last issue with Jason in this movie, is the whole town of Springwood is aware of Freddy's existence and how much of a menace he is. Jason gets no love in this regard. And while everybody has accepted Freddy Krueger's supernatural abilities, what we get for Jason is that contrived scene where the cop shows up, briefly summarizes Jason's backstory, and then proposes that he's a copycat killer. What could and should have happened instead is they should have brought on a character like Tommy Jarvis, or even a CIA agent, because at this point, chronologically, the government is aware of Jason and his supernatural abilities. They could be the ones that show up and info dump about Jason and hype him up as this secondary antagonist. But no, they fumbled the ball when it came to Jason, and he is half the fucking movie poster, half the fucking title of the movie, so that definitely does impact the score. Now let's talk about the survivor cast. Outside of Linderman, it was not a bad cast at all. In fact, I actually really liked this guy and this chick. But it wasn't a particularly strong cast either. But let's talk about what could have been. In a scrapped idea of the story, this movie was going to be Freddy versus Jason versus Ash, but due to some studio squabble, this didn't end up happening. But this would have given us a protagonist to actually be interested in and actually root for, instead of having the equivalent of a pig pen getting in the way of the two butchers we're here to see. Another scrapped ending was to have a surprise cameo from Pinhead, who would end the fight between the two unkillable killers by dragging them back to hell. And this would have also been a good idea because it would have given said pigpen of survivors something interesting to do, researching and finding the lament configuration, which would have had an epic payoff. And unrelated to the cast of survivors, but while we're on the topic of scrapped ideas, they were also going to give this movie two different endings, one where Jason wins and one where Freddy wins, which would have been awesome. And what's upsetting about this is that there were no rights issues in the way of that idea, so they just decided not to do it, and that's fucking stupid. That would have been awesome. Overall, this movie at its core is a 5 or a 6. And if there were a dozen Freddy vs. Jasons, this is the score I would give it. But because this is such a big event movie, and because I am such a sucker for crossovers, I'm giving it novelty points, and I'm giving it a 7 out of 10. This brings the franchise to a 5.9 out of 10. Oh boy, everybody's favorite film to hate. This is gonna be a long one. Due to rights issues with the original films, this version of Freddy Krueger is the version that we get in Mortal Kombat 9 and Dead by Daylight. And that doesn't affect the movie score at all, but it does make those DLCs a bit disappointing. So I'm going to say a lot of things that you've probably already heard. And that's because my opinion of this movie aligns with the general consensus of this movie. But I am going to talk about a couple things that I see rarely talked about, if at all. And before we run through the long list of reasons why this movie flopped, let me just hop on the bandwagon of my fellow fans and give props to Jackie Earle Haley's portrayal of Freddy. No, he doesn't quite fill Robert Englund's shoes, but this take on Freddy could have breathed a new life into the franchise had the script been better. Alright, let's let this nitpicker rip, shall we? All the dialogue in this movie is impressively boring. I could write better dialogue in a rough draft, and dialogue is nowhere near my strong suit. The actress for Nancy was total dog shit, and she later admitted to not giving a fuck about the movie, implying that she didn't even try to give a good performance, so fuck her. And unlike New Nightmare, this movie is a perfect example of why forced fan service can ruin a movie. Because instead of going in the direction of originality, this movie tries to recreate some moments from the first film, and even if they did it right, it would still suck on account of being unoriginal. But they also half-ass it. The same scenes, 26 years later, are somehow worse. Along those same lines, the CGI on Freddy's face looks so goofy, and they really should have just stuck to a practical mask. When this guy's getting arrested, they don't read him his Miranda rights, which is ironic considering that's what got Freddy off the hook in that TV show I shit on in the intro. And also a detail that breaks immersion. Fuck you, get nitpicked. And I applaud the concept of micronaps being introduced into this movie because it's the shred of originality that it has. But it kind of takes away from the fun tug-of-war game that the teens typically play, going back and forth from dreams and reality. This is just my opinion, obviously, but the overlap between dreams and reality with Freddy sprinkled in isn't nearly as entertaining or scary. And then there's the infamous pedo controversy. And in case you're unaware, one of the biggest reasons people call this movie out is because they really highlight Freddy being a pedophile. And I agree, they shouldn't have done that. Unless they leaned into it a little more harder. And I may have lost you there, but please allow me to try and reel you back in. Let's talk OG Freddy. Because a fraction of the people against the pedophile shit claim that Freddy Krueger was never a child molester, he was simply a child killer. He just killed the children. And I have 3 counter-arguments to that. Originally, Wes Craven was going to make Freddy Krueger a pedophile, because he wanted Freddy to be the most monstrous thing he could think of, and surprise, surprise, child rapist came to mind. However, he sort of scrapped that idea in light of a series of sexual assaults involving minors, and he thought that'd be insensitive. Counterpoint 2. I say sort of because the subtext is still pretty clear.
I'm your boyfriend now, Nancy. Wanna suck the face?
No.
I should warn you, princess. The first time tends to get a little messy.
I mean, come on. This dude has always been a kid diddler. But counterpoint 3, Even in the happy imaginary land where Saint Freddy is above diddling kids, why is torturing them in gruesome ways somehow acceptable? It's always been confusing to me as a horror fan how people are okay with Art the Clown pulling that stunt with the salt and bleach, or 10 movies of saw traps, or even one of the child victims of Freddy himself having to be identified by dental records when Freddy was through with him. And that's from the same episode of that shitty TV show. But as soon as it's sexualized, it's disgusting and evil, and yeah, if somebody in real life has been sexually assaulted, I understand why they would want to avoid that kind of content. But the same goes for victims of violent crime who want to avoid horror movies altogether. And I completely understand the taboo of incorporating the sexual assault of minors in for shock value. But I don't think that's what this movie was trying to do. And this is where we pivot. Now, there was this whole subplot where Nancy and Quentin think Freddy was innocent, and this would have been an interesting and original direction to take the character, but I'm glad they didn't, because that wouldn't send the best message. But I am holding the fact that it was proposed and not followed through on against this movie. Like, it shouldn't even have been suggested if they weren't gonna go through with it. But what I think they were trying to do by taking the sexual subtext of Freddy Krueger and showcasing it front and center was actually to set a much more serious and darker tone for this movie. And if they leaned into this, it could have actually worked in this movie's favor. There is a moment in this film where Nancy's mother tells Nancy and Quentin about what Freddy did to them. And she suggests that these nightmares they're having is actually just repressed trauma. But this is a small moment quickly drowned out by the tsunami of bullshit this movie gives us. But if they leaned into this, Freddy Krueger could have been a metaphor for trauma, specifically trauma of sexual abuse. Dare I suggest this movie had potential to be elevated horror, and that would have definitely set it apart from any of the previous films in a good way. But ultimately, I agree. They should not have emphasized this aspect of Freddy Krueger because they didn't take it seriously enough. And it's gross because it comes off as disingenuous. And lastly, my biggest gripe with this film, and one that I have never seen mentioned, is this movie's utter lack of creativity when it comes to Freddy's dream powers. Let's compare the movie's first kills. In the original film, the first death is Tina being dragged to the ceiling and cut up, which follows after a long, terrifying dream sequence. The first kill in the third movie is Philip, the one that was puppeted by his veins to suicide. The first kill in A Nightmare on Elm Street 5 is Dan, and he is painfully melded into a motorcycle and steered into a semi-truck. The first kill in Freddy's Dead is a deaf kid, Carlos, who gets a face-hugger hearing aid that amplifies sound, then Freddy scratches a chalkboard until his head explodes. But in this film, Freddy stabs a guy with a knife. And the following kills are almost as uninspired. Outside of the aforementioned fan service, the only thing that Freddy uses his powers for is putting his victims in a different place. You're in a prison? Well, now you're in a boiler room. You're in a pharmacy? Well, now it's a boiler room. You're in a diner? Well, now it's a spooky diner. And that's the extent of his powers. Honestly, I find Freddy Krueger to be one of the most, if not the most, scariest horror villains of all time. And yes, part of that is because he's inevitable. I mean, you have to sleep at some point, so at some point he's going to get you. But an equally big part of what makes Freddy so scary, in my opinion, is his ability to manipulate the environment to attack you. Trying to get up the stairs? Boom, this shit happens. Trying to dive into a fucking swimming pool? Too bad, look at all this shit. Trying to do anything at all? Now you're a cockroach. It's fucking scary, man. And I meant what I said when I said if I was going up against Freddy, I would buy a gun and just kill myself. But I don't feel that way about this Freddy. The worst case scenario with this Freddy is he puts me in a different place and then he stabs me with his claws. It's at least worth my life to try and fight him. So yeah, this movie had all the potential in the world, and it decided to half-ass it at every fucking turn. It's getting a 3 out of 10. And this brings the franchise down to a 5.5 out of 10. Now, for those of you unfamiliar with my channel, my grading system is a bit different from the school's grading system, in terms of letter grades and their corresponding percentages. A 5 out of 10 is not an F in my eyes. It's closer to a C-. And along those same lines, I do not do decimals in the same way. I still round up if it's a 0.6 or higher, and I still round down if it's a 0.4 or lower. But at a 0.5, I am simply going to round up or down based on my opinion of the franchise as a whole. And all that to say, I'm still rounding it up to a 6 out of 10. Because as I said in the intro, this is my second favorite horror franchise of all time. Yeah, it has some shitters, but it also has some shiners. I don't really have any closing thoughts outside of that, so instead, here is my ranking of all the movies from worst to best. Coming in at the worst movie of the franchise, the absolute fucking shitty stinker asshole poop head stupid idiot movie, A Nightmare on Elm Street 2, Freddy's Revenge. Boo! Everybody boo this movie. Boo! Coming in at number 8 is Freddy's Dead, The Final Nightmare. But this movie actually comes in first place for most dishonest tagline. At number 7, the reboot. Somebody give Rorschach another chance, please. The blame is on the writers with this one. At number 6, A Nightmare on Elm Street 4, The Dream Master. This movie is more shallow than a pothole puddle. And the 5th best movie is the 5th movie, The Dream Child. Not the brightest gem in the collection, but this, in my opinion, is when the movies start getting good. At number 4, Freddy vs. Jason. Could have been better, but so could the competition. At number 3, Wes Craven's New Nightmare. A breath of fresh, recycled air. At number 2, we got A Nightmare on Elm Street 3, Dream Warriors. It's cheesy as hell, but so are quesadillas, and I like quesadillas. And I hate to be one of those guys, but the best movie in the franchise is the original. Wes Craven really caught lightning in a bottle with this one. Speaking of Wes Craven, it's no coincidence that my top 3 movies in the franchise had him involved. Truly one of the greatest horror directors ever. May he rest in peace. Alright, that does it.